to our next session, which is a presentation on Sustainability Suite by Amar Jadhav, Solution Architect Sustainability, SAP India.
So good evening all, and thanks for your time. I'll be covering some of the insights around sustainability for EV as a product. While of course EV by very nature of it is a zero emission product, of course in the use phase when it comes to the tailpipe emissions. But EV is also like any other product. It has its sourcing related impact, it has its manufacturing related impacts, and of course end of life related impacts. So the topics that I'm going to cover would be around sustainability. What are some of the key trends that we see in the industry? And this is not necessarily related to EV only, but for any manufacturing industry. Then we will look at a product life cycle view of, let's say, EV manufacturing or EV as a product, and try to understand some of the sustainability related opportunities across these life cycle phases. We will then look at sustainability is not only for sake of sustainability. Of course, there are positive outcome that you can drive to sustainability in terms of reducing the emissions or maybe increasing the livelihood of the community within which you operate or any such sustainability impact. But it's also business, correct? We are all in the business. So there are also impact on the business. So that's the aspect that I'll try to cover. And lastly, we'll pick some of these sustainability opportunity areas across the product life cycle and try to see how technology can help you support your sustainability journey or accelerate your sustainability journey, right? So let's look at the trends. The first one, I think most of us are aware, there is more and more demand from various stakeholders on corporates to disclose their sustainability related data. Like in India, from next financial year onwards, business responsibility and sustainability report is mandatory for corporates to disclose. Secondly, investors are not looking at only financial data anymore, but non-financial data to rate the corporates. And this is also one of the parameters that are being considered for, let's say, raising a fund from the market, correct? Where the cost of capital is an important factor. The second area is, we as a consumer are now very much aware. Of course, we have an access to a lot of information. Sometimes it's overwhelming, but then it's now we also appreciate or we also understand, the impact of a business being run sustainably, which is impacting environment and society in a positive manner. And that's why there's a trend where consumers and employees would like to associate it with a brand which is a sustainable at its very core. The third area is this whole talk about triple bottom line. I'm sure you would have also heard of this jargon, but it's all about how do you balance the profitability, how do you balance the impact of your operation on environment and the society. That's the other area that's also being widely talked about. Now looking at these trends, there are various sustainability aspects. ESG is big term again, environmental, social and governance. But let's try to understand from the context of, let's say, product life cycle. And in this case, let's say it's an EV product, and it has its own phases, typical phases like raw material, inbound transportation, manufacturing, outbound, then use, and then finally end of life. Now let's look at some of the opportunity areas when it comes to the product life cycle. The first one being reducing the scope 1 and the scope 2 emission, which is the direct emissions associated with energy use or indirect emissions associated with the purchased electricity or any other form of energy. On the same line, the value chain emission, which is a scope 3 emission, which is cutting across the life cycle phases. And if you look at in the manufacturing stage, you know, the very nature of product and how do you go about designing a product also impacts, you know, the footprint associated with that particular product. For an example, if you are adopting more and more design practices, which is reducing the waste from the very inception of the product, that itself is a good starting point, correct? And if you look at from a product life cycle standpoint, at every stage of the life cycle, there are a lot of environmental impact that is associated with it, which is a footprint. And if you have that visibility of how much footprints are associated across my life cycle at different phases of the product, you have an opportunity to look at where can I reduce those footprints associated with the product life cycle. Similarly, and of course, when you design a sustainable product, you also have to have a sourcing, the supply chain in place. That's where the sustainable sourcing comes into the play. One of the aspects when it comes to sustainable sourcing is you would like to have more and more information from your suppliers about the raw material that you are procuring from them, their environmental footprint, so that you can consider them, you can incorporate them when you are calculating the entire product life cycle, right? And the core processes around manufacturing, which is EHSM, you know, which is environment, health and safety, energy consumption, water consumption, waste generation, and so on and so forth. In the outbound transportation, this whole concept of returnable packaging material, which is, you know, the pallets, the containers, and the other areas. So how do you ensure that you are able to extract more value out of the returnable packaging material that is already there in your supply chain? So bringing it back into supply chain, use the location information, the status information in the planning, and so on and so forth. Vehicle in use, wherein, you know, one of the design aspects that you consider is how do you bring such a certain design intervention through which you are able to extend the life of the vehicle. And that's also an opportunity to reduce an inflow of the material, because now you are able to extend the life of the material and you are able to reduce the reliance on, you know, some raw material which otherwise is required to manufacture a new product. Product as a service, I think Chetal did talk about it, which is also one of the sustainability opportunity where instead of selling a product, you sell it as a service, where you increase the utilization of the vehicle, increase the utilization of your product. And lastly, you know, end of life, where you recover the material, which is again can be brought back into the supply chain, or maybe you would like to sell it in the secondary market, right? So those are the areas that we could understand in terms of where the sustainability opportunity lies in the entire product life cycle. Now let's look at, this is the sustainability aspect, but as I said, there is also a business sense to pursue all of these opportunities, correct? When you look at scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emission, it's directly impacting the cost of operations, because you are able to reduce the energy that is otherwise required to produce your product in the manufacturing operation, and thus you are able to reduce the cost of operations. When it comes to responsible sourcing, you are ensuring that the supplier that you are onboarding is having a good ESG performance. You know, because nowadays in social media, any bad news, you know, kind of spreads like a speed of light, and that can impact your reputation. The third area, and when you look at sustainable sourcing, there are a lot of areas like, you know, child labor use or a conflict mineral, and any such, you know, risks that are associated with the supply chain, correct? Which can actually damage your reputation. The third area is product design, wherein, let's say, if you are selling your vehicle in the EU market, and EU has certain regulations in place related to ELV, end of life vehicle, or maybe ROHS or REACH compliance that you have to comply with. If you are not able to fulfill those compliances, there is a risk of you losing out on the sales and also the reputation and the market share, correct? The last area is about product as a service, which is, of course, you will run your core business, which is manufacturing a car and selling the car, but also you may be looking at a new business models where you're offering car as a service. So that's another area where you can generate a new revenue stream. So these are some of the areas that I have picked from the earlier slide. Not all areas I have picked, but if you're interested, can share those slides as well. So this is how, you know, sustainability is also making a business sense, correct? Now let's look at the technology in some of these areas. The first area is scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. Now here, already in your supply chain, already in your operation, a lot of data are getting generated. One example, in manufacturing, you are consuming an energy. So that is one form of data. In your upstream supply chain process, you are procuring a raw material where you are incurring certain spend on a particular raw material. So there are a lot of data which is already generated in your operations. And how do we actually automate, let's say, collection of the data and converting that into an equivalent footprint, which is today done it in a very, very crude form, where there is an Excel sheet is floated around and manually somebody enters the data. The question mark of the quality and the accuracy of the data, quality and accuracy of the data is a question mark. So how technology can help automate the data collection and converting into a footprint, equivalent footprint. Secondly, once you have the visibility, then you identify the emission hotspot and then drive actions. Third, it's not about collecting and monitoring the emissions, but it's also about bringing it back into your operations. So for an example, nowadays some of the companies have initiated this what you call internal carbon pricing mechanism. One of the carbon pricing mechanism is carbon fees, where depending upon the carbon emissions that you are emitting, you will be charged a carbon fees. Now, when you charge a carbon fees, this information also gets reflected in your financials in the form of, let's say, a revenue getting, a carbon fee getting deducted, or a revenue is deducted by a carbon fee, or a profit is deducted by a carbon fee. So there is also integration that is possible in the business processes, which will again help you to look at, okay, how some of these strategies are working for you, what are different ways that you are able to adopt to reduce the carbon emissions, correct? So that's where technology can play a role. Second area is product footprint. So where maybe some of the manufacturers would have done a study on the life cycle assessment of the entire product, which is cutting across multiple environmental impact. It could be a land use, it could be a carbon emissions, it could be a water, it could be a biodiversity loss, or any such impact because of the entire product life cycle. So there's a LCA database, and then there is also a business application. Now if you combine all of them, both of these data, which is LCA database and ERP, then you would be having a visibility of at any point of time, what is the inventory that you have in terms of raw material, in terms of finished product, and through an LCA database connection, you would know that at any point of time, what is the life cycle assessment, or what is the product footprint associated with your product in the raw material form, or maybe in the semi-finished goods form, or maybe in the maybe a finished goods form. And again, like in scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions, you are able to drive actions also through these insights. The third and most important thing is that you are now able to prove the sustainability claims of your product, that my car is 30% circular. And how are you able to prove it? Because I have a life cycle assessment data, I have an inventory data, and this is the kind of footprint associated with my product, this is the kind of material that I'm using, and because of which I'm able to reduce the footprint associated with my product. So these are the three areas that technology can help. The next one is responsible sourcing. I think this I did talk about briefly in that mother slide, anchor slide rather, which is all about how do you ensure that the supplier that you are onboarding is meeting the ESG criteria, correct? And there's a lot of information now available in the public domain about the suppliers, about their I would say supply chain, or maybe some issues that they have within their operations, and so on and so forth. So how technology can help let's say bring all of these data together and possibly calculate an ESG score for a supplier and a risk score for a supplier, which you can then take into consideration when you are, let's say, awarding a contract to a particular contractor, or maybe you are evaluating whether this is the right fit for our operations or not, and so on and so forth. So these are some of the areas where technology can again help. The next one is sustainable product design. Now this is an important aspect. As I mentioned, design is where you can actually make a huge impact. so if you know this circular economy principle, one of the principle is design out the waste. That means you are making certain decisions in the design stage itself so that the downstream waste can be eliminated, or you can extend the life of the product, correct? So let's say you made those decisions, now you want to enforce those decisions into business processes. So for an example, the design specification gets converted into a sourcing specification, correct? As part of this specification, you are making it mandatory for suppliers to disclose the environmental footprint associated with the part or a component that they are supplying, and so forth, correct? And of course, it is not about sustainability criteria, but there are regulatory aspects also involved, like EU, as I said, there's a rich compliance that you have to comply with, ROHS, which you have to comply with. So how do you enforce all of these compliance requirements in the product design itself so that the subsequent process or downstream process takes care of all of these aspects? And this is important because if you are not meeting those requirements, then there's a chances that you may lose the market, and there's a huge loss of sales that you will incur, correct? So that's where the business sense also business sense is also there. Lastly, product as a service, which is again today we all have cars, and probably all cars comes with the telemetry, and now let's say I have a Honda car, Honda knows where I am, how much I'm driving a car, how I am using a car, and so forth. But then this is also an opportunity with these connected cars or connected products for OEM to offer it as a service rather than selling it upfront. And then once they sell it as a service, they also have to ensure that they have a revenue management process in place, which is a car telemetry, which is giving you utilization data, usage data, is actually integrated with the billing application, like a subscription billing, or maybe any such revenue management related processes that they may have, correct? And lastly, it's also making sense that if these cars are connected, you have now visibility of how these cars are being used, how these cars are being utilized, what are the kind of problems that the customers are facing, to bring it back into the design in the R&D phase, so that you can further improve on the overall product design and the performance of the product. So these are some of the areas where technology can play a role. And this was a short presentation. I do not have any further slides, but that's what I wanted to share. If you are interested to have a detailed version of this deck, you can drop me a mail, or we can connect over dinner. I can share those slides. So that's what I wanted to communicate. And thank you very much for your time.